And hopefully everybody just got the Big Brother warning that you're being recorded. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Doug Larkin, and I'm really happy to be here with you. This is the inaugural AERA Science Teaching and Learning Book Chat, and I'm really thrilled that my friend and colleague David Stroupe could be here with us tonight to talk about his fantastic book, Growing and Sustaining Student-Centered Science Classrooms. I'll introduce David in a moment, but if I can take over everybody's screen just very briefly, just to announce some of the future book chats that we have on deck. Share screen, here we go. Okay. So in October, we have Amanda McCrory and Michael Rice, who are going to talk about their book, The Place of Ethics in Science Education. That book, I believe, is being released this week. Then in November, we have Erin Furtek with her just out. I just got this in the mail this week. Formative Assessment for 3D Science Learning. Very excited about that. Then in December, we have Mark Winchell will be joining us for his new book, Teaching Climate Change, Fostering Understanding, Resilience, and a Commitment to Justice. And then Tuesday, January 30th, in the new year, can't believe it's almost 2024 already, John Rudolph from the University of Wisconsin will be joining us to talk about his new book, Why We Teach Science and Why We Should. So let me stop this share now. And the announcements for all of these will come out the same way that you've got this announcement. If you don't follow us either on our listserv, if you're a member of the AERA Science Teaching and Learning SIG, you probably received the registration for this talk that way. We also posted it on the platform formerly known as Twitter, and probably in the future will get known as Twitter. But we're still posting things there, and then to some various other listservs. So just keep your eyes open. If in doubt, we're keeping that Twitter presence open, and so you can look for announcements there. And please follow us at AERA STL on Twitter. And here we go. Post on Threads too, please. All right. Well, we'll give that a shot. I know I signed up for one, and then I haven't looked at it since. But let's see. Okay. So I'd like to introduce our guest. David Stroupe is an associate professor at the University of Utah and was previously the associate director of STEM teacher education at the Create for STEM Institute, and the director of Science and Society at Michigan State University. So I'm really pleased to announce our guest, David Stroupe. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm honored to be the first one. I love this idea of doing this. Doug and I were emailing before about some ideas about how we want to do it, and I love this idea of just sort of a chat about the book and the process. And it's nice to see people, friends and new friends and people from far and wide. So thanks everybody for making the time to come. And I want to say before we start, Doug hasn't said it yet, but if you've not yet seen the book, I don't know if you can, it's kind of fuzzy on my screen. Doug kindly wrote a blurb for the back of my book. So I appreciate that. If you ever need a book blurb, you ask Doug, because he is really good at them.
Well, Doug read the whole book before he blurbed it because he wanted to know what he was talking about. So I did my homework and read the thing before the blurb. So.
Yeah, there you go. Not everybody does that. So there you go. That's good.
Well, all we have is our credibility and our reputation.
That's
but I knew it was going to be a great book. I just wanted to know how great it was.
That's excellent. Excellent.
So just a brief thing about these book chats. The idea, the AERA Science Teaching and Learning SIG is open to anybody who's an AERA member. And, many of us are part of professional organizations, but many of those things that we're joined up to don't actually have events or ongoing things. And we wanted to have something that was, something that we could say was for the Science Teaching and Learning Special Interest Group of AERA. And, the old rule of create a club you want to join, create an event that you want to go to. I really want to talk about books with people, and I want to hear about their books. So the way that we're framing this is for people who may have read the book, and I know some of my students are on here because we actually read the book for our science methods class this year. but I also want to make this open to people who maybe haven't read the book previously. And so we'll kind of keep both of those audiences in mind as we have our discussion. So David, I wonder if I could just ask you to start by just giving us a brief overview of your book.
Yeah, great. That's a great way to start. So I'm going to start by thanking the two teachers who allow me to tell their stories in the book, and then allowed me to live in their classrooms for a year, which is very much related to your question, Doug, about sort of the overview of the book. So Lindsay Burke and Anna Kramer, those are their real names. They said we can use their real names. They were students of mine when I was doing my PhD at the University of Washington, and they were in secondary science methods class. And they were actually part of my dissertation work. So I lived in their classrooms for a year along with some other teachers. And I learned a lot, which I'm sure we'll get into, about taking the ambitious science teaching practices and tools that we've been working with in our science methods class. And they were some of the first teachers to actually try those out with students and make a lot of adaptations. So I learned a lot from them. But we'll get into that. The overview of the book is I was asked by Harvard Education Press to take on the challenge of taking some philosophical ideas that I've written about before around epistemic agency and epistemic injustice, and to write a book for teachers. So often the lenses that we use as researchers and scholars, we're sort of talking to each other. And we hope maybe that some of the ideas will trickle down into classrooms. But this was an ask specifically for teachers, which was a great challenge and an important one. So the overview of the book is thinking about how teachers recognize and use students' ideas to create opportunities for the negotiation of science communities in classrooms. On the surface, that sounds pretty easy, right? That sounds like something we've all thought about. That sounds like something we've read, something maybe we've learned about in our methods class. What I learned from living in Lindsay and Anna's classrooms is that it's not easy at all. And it sounds kind of superficial in the sense that like on a 30,000 foot level, that we could every now and then give a head nod to students and say, that's a good idea, and somehow they'll participate. But what I learned living in their classrooms was it's really a combination of the big picture that they had about the goals for science teaching and learning, but also the moment-to-moment interactions. And I don't think I realized how important those moment-to-moment interactions are between a teacher with power and students that are often positioned without power. So the book is for teachers to think about both sort of the big picture of what you want to accomplish in a classroom and those moment-to-moment interactions about how you place value on students' ideas and open up opportunities for them to engage in science, but through the philosophical lens of epistemic injustice.
Thanks. And that's actually leads nicely into the next question. So you mentioned Miranda Fricker,
Yep.
and just I wonder if you can kind of unpack the idea of epistemic justice for us.
Yeah, you bet. Miranda Fricker is a feminist epistemologist, so she's a philosopher. And in 2007, she wrote a book called Epistemic Injustice. I think there's two important things to note about her idea, and then I'll describe it a little bit. So the first one is she put a name to an idea that a lot of people have talked about for a long time, right? So there's been critical scholars, there's been LGBTQ scholars, there's been race theory scholars who have talked about not being heard and listened to. And Miranda Fricker was the first person to put a name on it, but she's not the first person to sort of describe the ideas. The second one is, and I think this is my fun challenge of reading outside of the field of education, is Miranda Fricker is a philosopher. She's not an education scholar. She's not a K-12 classroom teacher or anything. So I love reading about ideas that get my gears turning and makes me think about what I can do in classrooms. The big idea of epistemic injustice, before we talk about epistemic justice, is that there are structures in place, whether they're moment-to-moment interactions, whether they're systemic structures, whether they're sort of cultural structures, that make it so that people with power choose not to hear or value ideas of people that they that are maybe unlike them, or that they choose to marginalize. So oftentimes there are pretty explicit ways, or there's some implicit ways of people with power not listening to or choosing to ignore the words and actions of people without power. So often the examples that you'll hear of are in medical things or law areas, or sometimes in clergy, of people not being heard or understood. But I saw a lot of parallels between those ideas and what happens in classrooms. So to me, where she and others, there's been a lot of wonderful work by people like Christy Dotson, who are Black feminist epistemologists as well. And they'll then think about what would it be like for people without power to have a voice in those kinds of contexts. So that's kind of a big overview. And if you want, we can dive further, but it starts to make your head hurt a little bit.
Right. But that's okay. This was the part, if this was an NPR interview, I would give out the phone number for people to call in.
Yeah.
But I have I'm going to throw a couple more questions your way, but I also want to encourage people to go ahead and post some questions in the chat. And then when we get to that point, if you want, I can read your question, or if you would prefer to just come on camera and ask David your question, we can do that as well.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that, you know, trying to take these ideas from philosophy and give them traction in the real world. And I think one of the places that happens with the greatest amount of friction is this notion of curriculum and the constraints that teachers may feel over, you know, and again, this may get beyond into just regular old agency rather than epistemic agency.
Yeah.
But how do you think about that? You know, like in terms of teachers being able to make choices to do particular things in their classroom, and we can say related to epistemic injustice and epistemic agency, but I think there's a broader question there as well about, you know, somebody who says, well, can I do this in my classroom? I have a, you know, I got to finish this FOSS kit. How can we do this?
I got to do the FOSS kit. I got to cover this, right? Yeah.
Right.
I think, I mean, we can certainly dive further, especially if people want to. I definitely have thoughts about it. I feel like, Doug, you're hitting on one of the big central tensions that I think we face sort of in science education, but also in K-12 schools, right? So it's, do we value students obtaining some sort of correct answer that someone in a position of power has prescribed for them? Is that the solitary goal? Or is the purpose for students to be able to learn knowledge that people have developed over millennia, and then do something with that knowledge that people with power might not have thought of before? I think there's sort of a tacit agreement in a lot of schools that we're aiming for the former, that we really, we will present students with opportunities to have what I would call like pseudo agency. So we want students to appear to have choice and appear to be able to take actions, but really the teacher is still guiding the entire conversation and has an outcome in mind. Where I know a lot of complexities arise is the uncertainty around letting students take more drive and control of what happens in a classroom. I remember being a teacher. I used to teach 7th grade in Houston, and I remember being a teacher and being really afraid of what would happen if I didn't know the answer, or being really afraid of what would happen if we left class with a lingering question that remained unanswered, or if a student said, I'm really interested in this, can I go sort of study it on my own and bring the answer back? I remember feeling really uncomfortable about that. So I do appreciate the tension around that. And I think one of the hopes of the book is that through Lindsay and Anna's stories, they're not all success stories, right? I think a lot of books often present only success stories. So they're not all success stories. And I one of my hopes is that people reading the book or engaging with the ideas would see that Lindsay and Anna live through these really tense and uncomfortable moments of uncertainty, but because they allowed students to take the lead on a lot of what was going to happen in class, it opened up opportunities that wouldn't have been available otherwise.
Just out of curiosity, what constraints did they have on what they could teach or how they could teach it? And then we'll go to the questions in the chat next.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. I think they face sort of the big three, right? I always think about the big three challenges for teachers. So one is certainly curriculum that you brought up, Doug. There's certainly a wonder as a teacher that someone above me in a position of power, like a district leader or curriculum person, whoever, has given me what I'm supposed to teach, and I can't deviate from that because somehow my evaluation depends on it. So curriculum is one. Another one is administration. So I feel like even well-intentioned administrators often put explicit and tacit constraints on what they feel comfortable allowing teachers to do, and the risks that they're allowing teachers to take pedagogically. And then the third one is just the responsibility of being a person in power standing in front of kids in a class who are looking to you to help them learn. And I hope and I think that most teachers take seriously that responsibility, but I do think that there's a default image we have of wanting to be in charge, wanting to be in control, and because we're the adult and feeling worried that if we redistribute some of the power we have, that we're somehow letting go of the responsibility we have to children.
Thanks for that. I see a comment in the chat. Justice, do you want to jump in and say it out loud for folks?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Doug. Sorry about that. I'm cooking dinner while
That's
that's
great.
So I like this idea of uncertainty in science classroom is not commonly accepted as a norm. I think we all know there's a big mismatch between simulated practice, which is what you sort of laid out for us there, and what happens in university settings and in industry around the world. And so I wonder, David, thinking about some of these sort of tension points you sort of raise, where you think is good starting places for maybe research and practice to help support, if you want, agency for teachers. I would imagine, for instance, I was a biology teacher for 10 years, it being a very uncomfortable space to navigate. Now I'm a professor, so it's like supporting 30 doctoral students in the classroom on their own inquiries. What would be the starting place, would you say, for supporting that kind of practice?
So you've asked two really great questions, Justice, in one. So the first one is, as sort of scholars of education or students, who can we turn to help guide our thinking about this sort of theoretically? I would point in science education, especially, I would point to our good friend Eve Manns, who is and Enrique Suarez, who have written a lot together about uncertainty. They're excellent, just sort of excellent guides about things we could be thinking about. Their focus is elementary, especially, but I always read their work and find a lot of guidance from my own thinking about secondary classrooms. Your second question is a little more complicated, but it's really important, Justice. And I think for teachers, part of what I try to do in the book is think about multiple entry points for teachers. So I think a lot of teachers in districts and administrators have a pretty shared goal overall, which is, I think, in some way or shape or form, to have students be really enthusiastically engaged in authentic science. And I think if you when I go work with districts, if that's sort of the shared assumption we have, that we all want kids to be doing good science that matters to them, that they feel like they can and should participate in, I think then it's important for us and for teachers to get a pulse on where they want to start. So there could be lots of ways in, right? Student talk would be one way that you could imagine your work with teachers and say, when kids are talking in your class, what are they talking about? Who's doing the talking, right? But another entry point, you're a biologist, I was a biologist, that was my background, might be something around complex scientific modeling, right? So take, an ecology example of wetland draining. Here in Utah, the Great Salt Lake is always a worry, right? So perhaps that's a way for teachers to think about the kind of problems they want students working on in their class. But I think the best role that we have in working with teachers is to help them think about what matters to them, and then picking like what's the on-ramp into reimagining how they think students should be participating in their class.
Thanks. We have another question from Suzanne Patzelt. Suzanne, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. So I kind of admitted I haven't read the book yet, but I want to. But I was just wondering, so you've already started talking about flexible practices or approaches, but I was wondering if you could talk a little more about what are some of the other approaches besides, like, obviously giving up some of the control and having uncertainty, and you've just mentioned a few other things, but maybe to talk about a few more.
Suzanne, I appreciate that you're book curious. And I'm going to do a teacher move. And I'm actually going to ask you a question back, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. I'm really curious as to what you mean by the phrase giving up control that you wrote in the chat. What do you mean when you say giving up control?
Oh, I was echoing back the previous conversation that was just happening. So this idea of when you were talking about yourself as a teacher, and if you didn't know the answer to something, which when I first started teaching, I felt similarly too. You felt like my go-to move was to say, oh, we don't have time to talk about that today. We'll talk about it tomorrow, and rush home to Google it. So I also had that sentence. So that's kind of what I was talking about. So I was just hoping that you could maybe elaborate on some of the other things you discuss in the book.
Suzanne, that's a great example, because I've actually, in my own research, I have seen teachers. I thought that I was the only one that did something like that. I'm glad to know I have a partner in that. But I see teachers doing that often, which is kind of like it's almost like punting in football, right? Where you just say, let's just I got to get out of this situation. So my default response will be like, we'll talk about that next week. Or that's a great idea. We don't have time for it. Put it up on the wall. We'll get to it. And no one ever gets to it, right? Like it's kind of a dismissal, but almost out of a state of panic about like, I don't know what to do, right? So I don't think about it as giving up control. I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing your thinking about that. I think the idea of giving up control is what scares teachers. But I actually think that teachers have a crucial role to play in creating and sustaining, which is the title of the book now that I think about it, creating and sustaining a classroom in which kids feel safe to participate. So always around what's happening in the classroom, the teacher is hopefully sort of changing their actions over time based on what kids are doing. But there is always a sense of guidance. There's always a sense of, I know that I'm in a position of power. And so kids are looking to me to legitimize their thinking, legitimize their actions, to know that they can take these kinds of risks. So the actions that teachers use are crucial in helping these classrooms thrive. Where I see, to your question sort of about flexibility in practices, I think where a lot of teachers get worried is they will learn about something in a methods course, learn a particular practice or engage with particular tools, and they will worry that in a classroom, no matter the age, no matter the setting, no matter the what's happening around in the school setting, that to be a successful teacher means I have to use the practices and tools that I learned exactly as I learned them. Because I saw a teacher educator use them with me. I felt pretty good about it. I got an A in my methods class. So that must be the way to teach. And I see Marco lurking around somewhere. I think we would push you to say, I know from our work with ambitious science teaching, that the practices and tools that you encounter in a methods class, out in the world, wherever you encounter them, that's a beginning. And I think we want teachers to have a really strong start. We want teachers to have access to what our field understands to be the best practices and tools available. But inherent in teaching is the idea that you build relationships with your kids and you adapt to whatever their needs are in your setting. So a lot of what you will hopefully encounter in the book, Suzanne, when you read it, is you will see examples of the tools and practices that Lindsay and Anna encountered in the class that Mark and I taught, adapted and remade almost by kids in the class because of what they were working on together.
Thanks, David. At this point, I want to encourage anybody. We don't have to type questions in the chat. This is our first one. So if anybody would like to join the conversation, feel free to use the hand raise, or if you feel more comfortable typing the question in the chat, we can ask it that way.
I'm gonna do something. So I got a message from one of my PhD students at Michigan State. And Kate, if you don't mind, I'm gonna put you on the spot.
Kate's on blast. Hi, Kate.
There's Kate. I don't know if you're still there, Kate.
Hello.
Kate, will you ask
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Will you ask your funny question that I know why you asked to everybody?
In a class that I took with David, really in every interaction with David, he has challenged me to think about how do we define teaching and how do we define learning? And I think you're proposing a different version of teaching and learning than what many teachers may have been trained for or think of in their own science classrooms. And so I'm wondering if you could share your own definition as a challenge. What is teaching and what is learning in this different context?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. It's good to see you. I'm very thankful that Kate brought up a huge framing question, right? Which I think it's all on all of our minds anyway. And I do think that, Doug's book touches on this. If you've not read Doug's book, you should, about diversity in classrooms. I think that there's a huge questioning as teacher educators and science educators about the purpose of teaching and learning in schools. So I think about teaching as an adult interacting with children in some sort of formal setting, because I think of through the lens of schools, that provides them with opportunities to increasingly take on responsibility for knowledge production and practices over time. I think about learning through sort of 4 different lenses. So I think about learning in terms of knowledge development, like do students and teachers know something that they didn't know earlier? I think about learning in terms of practices. So do words and actions change over time? I think about learning in terms of identity. So are people becoming someone else, or are they solidifying who they are because of opportunities presented or denied to them in a setting? And then I think about agency. So I think about not only our knowledge, practice, and identity shifting or becoming solidified, but I think about how people choose to take actions to change an outcome, to provide opportunities for other people, and to push back on injustices that happen. There you go, Kate.
Easy peasy.
Easy peasy.
So we have about 15 minutes left. I want to encourage anybody who would has a question for David Stroupe to go ahead and either just raise your hand, or you can type the question in the chat. I have a kind of complex question for you, David. So I want to wait a second to see if anybody else wants to. Oh, here we go. Adam Johnson. Okay, we're hearing from the gentleman from Utah.
Yeah, my new northern neighbor.
Yeah. Welcome to our fair state, your fair state now.
Yeah.
So I hadn't thought of this question beforehand, but when you introduced the book as like thinking about method students, I was thinking, I'm teaching methods and I'm using Mark's book with Jessica and Melissa, and I'm using Doug's book, and I've used Brian Brown's book, and I'm thinking of readings from Rudolph's new book. And now I'm thinking like, I'm gonna crush these people. Like, and now I used to not use any text at all. And now I'm kind of wondering if I should go, I mean, of course I should use the new Stroupe book, but I'm kind of struck by like how much we're kind of making our pre-service teachers shoulder. And as you were saying, like we want them to develop. So I don't know if you can speak to like, what's the balance of what they
Yep.
should be prepared for versus just like open to, like what's kind to our
Yeah.
future.
What's kind, and also what is our role as teacher educators and preparing them to start off in a successful way and feel like they can and should do this kind of work. The best way that I've heard described, where I think about sort of the balance between reading and action, whatever, is my good friend Karen Hammernis talks about teacher education frequently provides pre-service teachers, so people learning to be teachers, frequently provides pre-service teachers with a reach of where they want to go, but no footing to get there. And so I feel like she has a good rock climbing analogy, right? Of like, you can see where you want to go, but you have to get started. And so I feel like my worry, I feel you, Adam, my worry in providing too many readings to pre-service teachers is they can read all they want and they can read a lot, but I want them to feel like the ideas that they're encountering are actionable and that they have concrete practices and tools to take with them into a classroom to get started. So I think about that sort of balance, if there is a balance, as I want to simultaneously I want to like disrupt how pre-service teachers think about to Kate's question, I want to disrupt how pre-service teachers think about their work. I want to dispel this sort of mythology that they have that they're going to be Robin Williams standing on the desk, right? The sort of Hollywoodization of teaching. But at the same time, disruption isn't enough. We have to give them opportunities to rebuild what's possible. So I have them read some, and I think we all do, but I also have them engage in pretty complex teaching rehearsals. Because it's one thing to have them read an Eve Mann's paper about uncertainty, but it's another thing to sort of Justice's point too, like it's another thing for pre-service teachers to live through it and to feel uncomfortable and to pause as a methods class and say, like, let's sit in this moment of uncertainty together. It feels strange, doesn't it? What are we going to do about that? What should we do? What are some of our options as teachers, and what's maybe a good path forward? So I think I worry either way, Adam. I would worry if pre-service teachers only encountered readings and didn't have opportunities to rehearse. But I would also worry if they only had opportunities to rehearse and didn't have any sort of theoretical or framing readings to see the rehearsals through.
Thanks. Again, so if you have a question, please feel free to either raise your hand or type something into the chat. I'll give just a little bit of wait time here so we can do some cognitive props.
Can I ask a question?
Floor is yours.
Okay, I would love to open it up and hear from people too about, someone asked me, I think maybe it was even Doug, about some of the challenges that teachers encounter. You know, I have my experience in working with teachers, but I would love to hear from other people. What are some of the challenges that your teachers encounter? And then maybe as a community, how can we think together about helping teachers reimagine what's possible in their classrooms?
Can you restate go ahead.
I'm going to jump in on this real quick because I just taught, let's see, 45 pre-service teachers today. So we were talking about, and I'm from Texas, so let that frame some of what I'm about to say.
I see your shirt that you have on that says Texas. So yes.
Yeah, it says Texas Tech actually. So
okay, I know where that is. That's in Lubbock. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So we were talking about this today because, especially with like injustice in Texas is a bad word. Like, we are being hit with all of these like
Right.
legislative policies that say diversity, equity, and inclusion are no longer something we're going to support in the classroom, at the university level, anywhere. So we're having to reframe some of what we do in the classroom. And I'm trying to figure out how to keep my students passionate about diversity, equity, inclusion, and like addressing systemic injustice and what exactly you've talked about in your book. But it is so hard with this
Yeah.
legal thought. It's like, yes, I want them to do this. I'm going to prepare them the best I can. But how do I do this in the face of this political and legislative like flood of anti-diversity initiatives?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I have a quick thought about that, but I also really want to open that up to everybody, because that is a really complicated and important question.
Yeah.
My quick thought, and then please other people chime in. My quick thought is that part of what I having in Michigan too, and I'm sure in Utah, Adam, you could speak to this too. Part of what seems to really matter for the pre-service teachers in methods class, they'll read about race, they'll read about inequities, in all sorts of forms. The thing that seems to matter to them is wanting to make sure that they have talk and actions that they can take in classrooms to help students participate, and that they have a sense that equitable participation isn't something that means like all students talk.
Mm-hmm.
So they want opportunities to try out and maybe collect data about through action research or something, that they, especially as white teachers in a lot of our programs, that they as white teachers are doing the moment-to-moment interactions with kids, that they are planning lessons, that they are looking at a curriculum and trying to see it through a lens of equity and justice work in a way that will help students learn.
Yeah.
And to me, the huge challenge when I work with my teachers here is they, again, on this idea of responsibility, they feel such a responsibility to the kids, but also as brand new teachers, they know that they're not going to be able to change a school.
Yeah.
And they're not going to be able to change a system yet. Maybe someday, but maybe not yet. So the most powerful takeaway message for them in my context, seems to be that there's all this sort of noise going on around you. But when you're standing in front of your class, when you close your classroom door and you're standing in front of your class, in that moment, that's who matters. It's those in that room. And the choices that you make with those kids in that room in that moment has huge ripple effects, both for your own immediate sort of classroom setting, but then who knows, years from now, right? That you never know when your moment-to-moment interactions with kids are going to make a difference down the line.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
But
Chris.
other people, please, there's some.
Yeah, so we have a couple questions in the chat, and we'll take this conversation in different directions. Chandrika, would you like to ask your question, or I can read it if you prefer?
Sure, I can ask it. Thank you so much for this book chat. In the course that I'm teaching this semester, we're reading the textbook and the book as a textbook, and the students enrolled in the class are master's students and doctoral students, all of them science, different science disciplines. Some of them are teaching in high school classrooms, and some of them are teaching in higher ed community college classrooms. And so one of the things that we're talking about is with and Morgan State is an HBCU.
Yep.
So one of the things that we're talking about in class is just taking the access that we have to the influence that we will have as having people with being people with advanced degrees, with the lived experience of working, being either from a minoritized group or working in communities or schools where students are minoritized. how do we develop research that will be consequential? How do we develop research that will make a difference? And so one of the things I wanted to ask you is, you said that this book came out of your dissertation work. And so I wanted to see if you would be able to speak to the question of how did you frame collecting data for for your dissertation work? How did the book evolve out of that process? Because the book wasn't immediately after your dissertation, but how did it evolve from that data? And then going into it, what did you think about what would be the outcomes or the outflows for your work? And so sometimes when we are thinking about our research, we're like, man, I have a vision of a better world, a safer world, a more equitable, a just world, and this is my contribution to it. I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but I was just wanting to ask, what was your mindset? What was your thinking and questions, and what are your desired outcomes or outflows from your work?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to reference Mark again. And so Mark Winchittle is here. You can wave. Mark was my doctoral advisor, and I think one lesson that I have learned from him, especially in my dissertation process, was to as you were just saying, if you see something that you think is missing in the world, if you see something that you think is missing in the literature, then you don't have to wait on someone else to do the work. You can do it. And so I'm very thankful to Mark for sort of guiding me along. He encouraged us in the program to read philosophy of science and to get outside the science education box and to think about what other people were considering. And so I'm very thankful for him for sort of the freedom to do that. So step one to your question is, as an advisor, as someone working with doctoral students, not trying to box people in or not trying to bound people into a particular paradigm of thinking or working, that it's a really incredible time to have some intellectual freedom and try things out. So yes, this book is 10 years after my dissertation. So I finished my PhD program in 2013. The reason that these Lindsay and Anna's stories stuck with me, and that was because I, as a researcher, would read about these, kind of complex and abstract philosophy ideas. I would read wonderful education papers where people were in classrooms, but I had not yet lived through or experienced what it was like to take the ideas that we had been working on as a group at the University of Washington and watching first year and second year teachers do the day-to-day work of interacting with students. I was so astounded by how they fused their passion for equity with their commitment to building strong classroom communities with kids, and taking the practices and tools that we had helped them develop in a methods course and adapting them to their kids, that I as often as I can try and tell their story, because they and others that I've worked with as well, but they were the first people that I ever saw that really helped me learn more than I could have had I just read papers, to sort of Agnes' point. Because of my experiences in their classrooms and in other classrooms, I began to notice in science education and literature, from my perspective and the theoretical lenses that I was using, I began to notice the sort of tension that Doug highlighted at the beginning of our conversation around, I sort of glibly describe it as like, do we want to pretend that students are doing science, or do we want students to do science? And I feel like Lindsay and Anna were providing students with opportunities to do what and philosophers and historians might think of as more authentic science, which involves uncertainty, which involves tinkering, which involves asking questions that may not be resolved for a long time. That doesn't always align with curriculum goals that people are bringing up. That doesn't always align with pacing guides, but it seems more quote authentic to me. So in moving out of my dissertation, I knew I had, because of the teachers who kindly let me into their classrooms, I knew that I had some stories that I wanted to tell our field. And so I didn't try to write papers to be provocative. I tried to write papers that would accurately illustrate the wonderful work that I was seeing in classrooms. And it seemed to resonate with people so far, which is lovely. I have sort of two hopes to I love your question about what do I hope people do, or what are I sort of hopeful about where it goes. I hope that teachers and teacher educators and administrators will think about some things. I think that's a more immediate hope, a hope that I wrestle with, and I would love to hear from people as well, is thinking about policy changes. And I don't know, I hope that changes because of some of my ideas and maybe other people's ideas, but I still wrestle with how to take some of these ideas and talk with policymakers about that. So if anyone has thoughts, I'm all
Well,
ears.
David, that actually leads into our last question of the night.
Okay.
And Sandra, are you there? Would you like to ask it
I'm
out loud?
here.
Okay, the
Sure.
floor is yours.
I'm at Wayne State University in Michigan. So,
Oh yeah, down the road. All right, yeah.
right. And my question involves, how do we address the basic injustice of how even elementary science even gets taught at the elementary level? You know, I see suburban schools where they have wonderful science labs for their second and third graders, and then we look at some of our other schools where there is constant historical under resourced and under assisted, and there's just not even the time scheduled to teach about science.
Yep.
And then when we do teach it, then there's all kinds of questions. You're teaching critical thinking. What does that mean? And all the things about injustice that our neighbors from other states are all talking about too.
Yeah, I mean, I want to open that up to my elementary colleagues. If you're around, I would love to hear from you about that. I mean, so I work with secondary teachers, and my experience in working with elementary teachers, Sandra, as you noted, is that it's science is maybe not, it used to be sidelined at best, and now it's sort of ignored more commonly, it seems to me. The times that I have worked with elementary teachers, they find a way, they're really skilled at not thinking about, in elementary school, not thinking about disciplines as siloed. And to me, this is one of the great privileges of elementary school, I feel like. So instead of having math time, reading time, social studies time, science time, which is how I experienced some of elementary school, I'm sure we all did too, really thinking about the work as interdisciplinary. You know, if you're interested in particular things about, you know, in the state of Michigan, right, there's invasive Asian carp is trying to make its way into the states, a fish that's trying to eat everything. I've seen elementary teachers think about that through a lens of literacy and reading about it, through a lens of science, through a lens of social studies, and thinking about the policies around it. That's my way that I would approach it. But if anyone is an elementary colleague, please chime in, because I want to hear what you're doing, because I'm going to take notes.
You know, at the state level right now in Michigan, we're starting to address literacy and science as kind of conjoined. You know, you have to have something to read about. The research is all supporting that you're not fluent in literacy unless you have a subject to read about. So science is kind of a natural partner in that way.
Wonderful.
I think, as with any good educational experience, you're left with some resolution of questions, but then a whole lot. It's been generative. We get more questions out at the end.
Yeah.
I want to bring back my colleague from Texas for our closing here. Let me give a proper introduction. Chrissy Cross is our chair of our AERA Science Teaching and Learning SIG. And Chrissy, you want to close us out here?
Sure. I want to say thank you so much to Doug for organizing all of this. He does a fantastic job. He is our program chair this year, and he will be the chair next year. This SIG is in good hands with him. If you haven't thought about joining this SIG, please do it. We would love to see you at AERA. We would love to see David, you at AERA. Thank you so much for your work on this. It was fabulous. Like, I'm so honored to be in this Zoom room with all of y'all. I've learned so much, and it's just great to see your faces and connect. And if you have any questions about anything that you've heard, reach out to Doug, reach out to David. I'm just volunteering y'all for that. But go buy David's book and join AERA Science Teaching and Learning SIG.
Yeah. Can I add one more thing before we go?
Please. Hey, Mark.
So, yeah, I was David's advisor. And so there's an important thing here about David's career, and that is that when he was at the University of Washington, I don't know if I had ever seen a doc student who spent so much time in classrooms. I mean, this is where you get the intellectual authority to begin to make claims to the research community, is having done that work in classrooms. And David was always, you can see him in some of the videos on the Ambitious Science Teaching website. He and I are at the opposite sides of the room. And I don't know how many hundreds, if not thousands of hours we have spent watching teachers say things or provide opportunities or moments for kids to participate in ways that they had never been asked to participate before. And that is a form of equity and social justice. And David did that groundwork. He has probably seen more kids respond to more teachers and to peers than any other person I know in academics. And so I just want to say that he's done the work, and I consider him an authority in this area in my mind.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Mark. I love that. And that's just, it's so important as we all work in our areas to put that time in, right, in the classrooms. And I just really appreciate that comment. Thank you so much. Okay, any questions that y'all have, feel free to email Doug or David. And thank you so much for attending tonight. We know everybody's busy. We all have so much on our plate. So hopefully I'll see everyone in Philadelphia.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording and say goodbye to our people who are watching this in the future. Stop.